Welcome to the History of European Theatre podcast, and thanks for joining me on this journey through millennia of theatrical history. Episode 164, The Merchant of Venice, The Quality of Mercy is Not Strained. Last time, youthful romance, violence and death were in the air as Romeo and Juliet failed to find their way out of an endless feud, thanks to the cruel hand of fate. Fate also plays a large part in The Merchant of Venice, as do deep-seated grudges, but these are more societal than familial. We are in Italy still, but no longer in the close-knit Verona, but mercantile and outward-looking Venice. As Shakespeare wrote his play, London was becoming orientated around increasing global trade, and English trading ships were regularly making their way to Venice as a major trading hub. So perhaps it is no surprise that Venice, with its eyes on commerce and profit, was a suitably exotic setting for this tale of greed, love, and the clash of cultures. The Merchant of Venice is thought to have been written between 1596 and 1598. It is stylistically consistent with the other plays from this period, particularly the Henry IV plays, and is mentioned by Francis Mears in his 1598 list of plays, so there's a good chance that it was around a year or two before that. There are a couple of internal references in the play that also help to secure the dating. Early in the play, there's a reference to a ship called Andrew, which is thought to be an allusion to a Spanish ship called the St. Andrew that was captured by the English during a raid on the Spanish port of Cadiz during the Anglo-Spanish War in 1596. Then, a couple of scenes later, Shylock references the biblical story of Jacob and Laban, which is thought to have been prompted by its use in a publication called The Arraignment and Conviction of Usury, which was published in that same year, 1596. A quarto edition of the play was published in October 1600 under the title The Merchant of Venice, or otherwise called The Jew of Venice, where it was said to have been performed diverse times. It was printed again in 1619 as part of William Jaggard's collection of plays attributed to Shakespeare. You'll remember this was Jaggard's attempt to publish a play collection of Shakespeare's work for the first time. The legitimacy and accuracy of that collection is very questionable, and The Merchant of Venice is one of the contentious inclusions, as Jaggard didn't own the rights to publish the play at the time. That 1600 quarto was the basis for the first folio version, with just a few additions of stage directions and musical cues. The first quarto version is considered very reliable, and it is assumed that it was well copied from an original manuscript or a very good copy of one. The source material for the play comes essentially from two well-known moral or folk tales, that of the debt of a pound of flesh and that of the selection of a husband by a test of the three caskets. There was a Florentine version of the story called Gianetto of Venice and the Lady of Belmont. The pound of flesh element of this version is very similar to Shakespeare's, but the three casket element is significantly different. In this case, the Lady of Belmont also insists that her would-be husbands have to pay a fee and then have to stay awake long enough to woo and seduce her. It's only when her lady's maid warns Gianetto not to drink of the wine that she provides, which is drugged, that he succeeds. In another version called The Orator, which was translated into English in 1596, Alexander Sylvian's version includes a trial scene. Another suggestion is that when Shakespeare included the three-casket test into his version, he might have been using Boccaccio's Decameron as a source. But there were other versions around at the time, so really it's not possible to be definitive on this. As we've seen before, we have Shakespeare probably collating from several sources and then crafting a version of them to his own ends. It's also thought that there was an earlier theatrical version that combined these two stories. When Stephen Gosson wrote his diatribe against the playhouses in 1579, he mentioned a now lost play called The Jew, which he says showed the greediness of worldly choosers and the bloody minds of usurers. It is also difficult to imagine that Marlowe's Jew of Malta was not in Shakespeare's mind while he was crafting The Merchant of Venice. There is every indication that Marlowe's play was a great success when it was first played in 1689, and that it had continued to be popular since then. That play features a plotline where Barabbas, the Jew of the title, has a daughter who elopes with a Christian, a similar line to the one Shakespeare used in his version. If you'd like a reminder about Marlowe's play, you can find my take on it as part of episode 101 of the podcast. That's season 5, episode 14. The Jew of Malta had a revival by the Admiral's men in 1594, possibly in a response to a rise in anti-Semitism that followed the trial and the execution of Elizabeth's physician, Rodrigo Lopez. He was a Christian of Portuguese Jewish descent, who was not only the Queen's physician-in-chief, but involved with political correspondence between the court, Spain and Portugal. He may also have been involved in some spying. His downfall came through jealousy of the trust and wealth that he had acquired from the Queen, court intrigues, and the general belief in some parts of society that Jewish doctors were scheming to kill their Christian patients. The final trigger seems to have been when he revealed that he had treated the Earl of Leicester for syphilis. The Earl went after him, and the accusation of attempted poisoning stuck. Elizabeth delayed signing his death warrant for many months and returned his estate to his widow and son after his execution, suggesting that she did not really believe the accusations and held him in high regard. The position of Jews in Elizabethan England is obviously important to an understanding of the play, so I will come back to that. But first, here's a brief synopsis of the plot. The opening of the play establishes Antonio as a merchant who has several trading investments on the high seas, which has strained his finances, but if successful, will make him very rich. His friend Bassanio asks him for a loan so that he can travel to Belmont to woo the heiress Portia, who he loves. Antonio agrees to help him, but to do so, in his current situation, he has to borrow money. Confident in the return of his investments, he signs a bond with Shylock, the Jewish moneylender. Shylock, driven by the insults of the Christians and their past behaviour towards him, writes into the bond that should Antonio forfeit, the price will be a pound of flesh taken from near his heart. In Belmont, Portia awaits suitors for her hand who have to pass a test set by her late father. Caskets of gold, silver and lead are set out. The suitors have to guess which contains her picture to gain her hand. The Prince of Morocco guesses the gold casket, but is disappointed, as is the Prince of Aragon, who chooses silver. Back in Venice, Shylock's servant, Lancelot Gobbo, decides he needs to find a new master. His father suggests that he should find a position with Bassanio. As Lancelot and Jessica, Shylock's daughter, say their farewells, Jessica slips him a letter from Lorenzo, Bassanio's friend. She secretly hopes to elope with him and says that she will bring with her some of her father's wealth. With Shylock lured away from his home, Jessica, disguised as a boy, leaves with Lorenzo to be married. News arrives that one of Antonio's ships has foundered, and enraged by Jessica's theft of his wealth, Shylock begins the legal process of calling in Antonio's bond. At Belmont, Bassanio arrives and chooses the lead casket. As Portia and Bassanio celebrate his success and think on their forthcoming wedding, Nerissa, her maid, and Gratiano, Bassanio's friend, announce that they too are to be married. The ladies give the men rings to treasure. Lorenzo and Jessica arrive with the news of Antonio's certain ruin and Shylock's determination to claim the forfeit. Portia gives Bassanio double the 3,000 ducats due, and the men leave to save Antonio. Shortly after, Portia and Nerissa leave in secret with a plan to help. In the Venice courtroom, Portia arrives disguised as a young lawyer with letters of recommendation from a learned judge. Nerissa is disguised as her clerk. She advocates the upholding of the bond, but at the last moment reminds Shylock that he can only take flesh and not one drop of blood can be spilt. Shylock concedes and agrees to take the offered doubled repayment, but Portia argues that this cannot be in law as he refused it in court, and as he effectively planned the death of a Venetian subject, he should also forfeit the principal sum and his wealth is forfeit, half to the state and half to Antonio, with his very life at the mercy of the Duke. Antonio forgoes his share of Shylock's wealth, and persuades the Duke to reduce the sentence to the loss of half his wealth and conversion to Christianity, to which Shylock reluctantly agrees. In gratitude, Bassanio offers Portia the 6,000 ducats, but she refuses, and insists that they are only rewarded with the rings that he and Gratiano are wearing. As the couples arrive back at Belmont with Antonio, Portia and Nerissa test the men over the missing rings until they reveal why and how they have them. Portia tells Antonio that 3 of his ships have miraculously made it back to port intact and his fortunes are restored, and then tells Lorenzo that as Jessica's husband, he will inherit Shylock's remaining wealth when the old Jew dies. Perhaps not surprisingly, commentary on the play over the years has been dominated by the presence and character of Shylock. And although there is more to the play than just this, I too will start with him. There are essentially 2 opposing views to the character of Shylock, one that sees him as a vehicle for stirring up anti-Semitic feeling, and another that takes him to be rather sympathetically drawn and more complex than just a representation of a Jewish stereotype. Those who see him as this stereotype point to his avaricious trade and nature, how, for example, when Jessica elopes, he expresses any loss he feels first and foremost in monetary terms. He takes advantage of Antonio by charging him increased rates for his loan, and attempts to be merciless in the extraction of his debts when Antonio's ventures fail. The phrase, having your pound of flesh, has become synonymous with the extraction of payment of a debt to the point of cruelty. But the counter-argument, that Shylock is actually a sympathetic character, points out that he has been much maligned in the past by Antonio and, by extension through Antonio's friendship group, by most of the Christian society of Venice. It is they who are the hypocrites, sidestepping rules on money lending applied to Christians by using his services, but excluding him from normal society because of his heritage and religion. We may not go as far as liking Shylock, but we can see that he is ill-used and might feel his outbursts are somewhat justified. This is where the subplot of his daughter Jessica's elopement with a Christian really comes into play. It is this event, piled onto the other insults that he has to take, that really turns his attitude towards the likes of Antonio and drives him to chase his debt mercilessly. In the face of the hypocrisy of the Christians, there are points where Shylock commands a lot of dignity. As he says, "He hath disgraced me, and hindered me 500,000, laughed at my losses, mocked at my gains, scorned my nation, thwarted my bargains, cooled my friends, heated mine enemies. And what's his reason? I am a Jew. Hath not a Jew eyes? Hath not a Jew hands, organs, dimensions, senses, affections, passions? Fed with the same food, hurt with the same weapons, subject to the same diseases, healed by the same means, warmed and cooled by the same winter and summer as a Christian is? If you prick us, do we not bleed? If you tickle us, do we not laugh? If you poison us, do we not die? And if you wrong us, shall we not revenge? If we are like you in the rest, we will resemble you in that. If a Jew wrongs a Christian, what is his humility? Revenge. If a Christian wrongs a Jew, what should his sufferance be by Christian example? Why, revenge. The villainy you teach me, I will execute, and it shall go hard, but I will better the instruction." As his rage grows, he takes a hard and legalistic view over the debt, insisting that, "I have sworn an oath and I will have my bond." And then, "If you deny me, fie upon your law. There is no force in the decree of Venice. I stand for judgment." This is not just vengeance, although that certainly plays a part, but the view that this is exactly how the Christians, who are supposed to be forgiving at every turn, would treat him if the tables were turned. He is looking for equal justice, and the law here is his friend, and his only protection against a society set against him and his kind. He proudly and defiantly proclaims, "I am a Jew," but perhaps his best response to his tormentors, and at Antonio in particular, is, "You call me misbeliever, cutthroat dog, and spat upon my Jewish gabardine, and all for use of that which is mine own. Well then, it now appears you need my help. Go to, then. You come to me and you say, 'Shylock, We would have moneys. You say so, you that did void your rum on my beard, and foot me as you spurn a stranger cur over your threshold. Moneys is your suit. What should I say to you? Should I not say, hath a dog money? Is it possible a cur can lend 3,000 ducats? But there is no getting away from the fact that Shakespeare's creation is a very Elizabethan one. Shylock is an outsider, a hated alien, the cause of laughter and insult, all of which would, no doubt, have been cheered along by much of his contemporary audience. The idea of a completely sympathetic Jew was probably never in Shakespeare's sights. Perhaps what we see is just that hint of humanity that Shakespeare could bring to a character, even one that was essentially unsympathetic. So what was the context for Shylock? What was the Jewish experience in Elizabethan London? The vilification of the Jews started from when Christianity was adopted and the Jews portrayed as the villains of the piece for crucifying Jesus. In England, the Jewish community lived fairly freely and prosperously under the Norman kings through the 11th, 12th and 13th centuries, as they were subject to little or no financial constraints. But in 1290, Edward I was in need of popular support and a source of income to promote wars with France, and he responded to a rise in anti-Semitism by issuing an edict that commanded all Jews to leave the kingdom within 3 months. He seized their property as they departed. The edict was successful and remained in place for about 300 years, until under Parliament in the Commonwealth period, Jews were allowed to return. Some Jews did manage to remain in the country by converting to Christianity, nominally or genuinely, or by living under the radar, but there were very few Jews in the country, even 300 years later. However, vilification of Jews was still a popular trope in religion, folklore and literature. The two pre-Shakespearean plays I've already mentioned, The Jew and Marlowe's Jew of Malta, are typical of the presentation of the Jew as a grotesque, with few, if any, redeeming qualities. But in the theatre at least, the picture was not completely one-sided. A 1584 play called The Three Ladies of London features a Jewish moneylender who has an honourable character. But the fact is that there were very few Jews in London at the time, and most people would not have knowingly come into contact with one or had personal experience of a Jewish family living an observant life. Most of the Jews that were living in London were of descent from the Iberian Peninsula and kept practice of their faith secret. Any Jews who were employed by royalty or the aristocracy were brought into the country as physicians, teachers or translators, and typically were expected to undergo a conversion ceremony on arrival. The enforced conversion of Shylock certainly has some precedent. John Foxe, a priest-theologian who was staunchly pro-Protestant and author of the famous Book of Martyrs, was well known for having performed faith conversions. His view of the Jews was probably at the extreme end of things, but this was the type of thing congregations were hearing regularly and might provide some understanding of how Elizabethans viewed Jews. In one of his sermons, he speaks of the heinous abominations, insatiable butcheries, and treasons and madness of the Jews, along with their intolerable scorpion-like savageness so fruitlessly boiling against the innocent infants of Christian Gentiles. Even Foxe could not better Thomas Calvert's claim that Jewish men were cursed with menstruo sanguinis, or male menstruation. However, as trade and travel abroad increased in the late 1500s, exposure to other lands and cultures meant that foreign stereotypes were slowly becoming challenged. Merchant John Sanderson recorded what he called the moral carriage, understanding and honesty of the Jews he encountered on his travels. James I encouraged religious toleration, including that of the Jewish faith, and a slow shift in public sentiment towards Jews continued. The Jewish presence in England slowly increased, and in 1656 Parliament granted permissions for Jews to remain in England, and the first synagogue was opened in London. We don't know if Shakespeare knew any Jews personally, but he must have been aware of their presence in some high-profile positions at court, and as I've mentioned, of the fall of some of them. He would undoubtedly have been aware of the literary traditions around them, and that in 1516 Venice had been the first European city to force Jews to live in a segregated ghetto. Judging from the content of the play, he was aware of some of the details of this arrangement. In Venice, Jews retained commercial rights and freedoms and were not forced to convert. They were socially ridiculed and alienated, but allowed to contribute to the economy, a setting that gives Shakespeare space to explore these racial and religious issues. With all this attention to Shylock, it is easy to forget that there is comedy in the play, although we might find it not of some of Shakespeare's best. Lancelot Gobbo's clowning is awkward at best, and he presumably was there as a vehicle for Will Kemp to display his ability to extemporise. That would soon, we think, lead him into trouble with the company. Gobbo is, I think, perhaps Shakespeare's least successful comic creation, and a bit of a distraction from the two main plots, in which he plays very little part. The whole Portia casket subplot is light-hearted in its nature, with its cameo parts for two of the three suitors, and it includes some very nice, simple poetry and prose with a very romantic lilt to it, especially when Jessica and Lorenzo are enjoying their time as stewards of Portia's home just before her return. As the initial premise of the casket test left to his daughter by a dying father requires a lot of suspension of disbelief, as does the idea that she and her suitors would accept these conditions, we are allowed to regard all of this as a bit of fun. Of course, the premise that a moneylender would cause the death of a debtor rather than trying to find some way to extract increased repayment is equally as preposterous, but we don't have quite the same reaction to that. The final scenes after the courtroom drama are also intended to be highly comic, with the men trying to excuse themselves for giving the love token rings to others, while all the time Portia and Nerissa are teasing them, albeit a little cruelly. This is not quite the traditional wedding scene that ended a comedy since Roman times, but it comes very close to having the same comic, romantic feeling in an attempt to lift the play back into comedy at the end. Of the other male characters in the play, Antonio is the most interesting. He is also shown as an outsider, working in opposition yet somehow similar to Shylock. He is a merchant rather than an aristocrat, so new rather than old money. And he will never have the power associated with the aristocracy. But he is a good man to know and generous to his friends, even if the basis of that friendship is, initially at least, a financial one. But more than this, at one point he refers to himself as a tainted wether, that is, a castrated ram. This, and his erotically charged friendship with Bassanio, where the patron-to-client relationship seems a lot closer than it needs to be, has suggested to some commentators that he is gay. He certainly goes a long way out of his way to enable the ambitions of his young friend, or perhaps we should say protégé. Significantly, perhaps, he is the only single character at the end of the play. Parallels have been drawn with Shakespeare's ambiguous sonnets seemingly addressed to an unidentified young man. Perhaps Antonio's assistance in the prospective marriage of Bassanio is a means to extract himself from a spent relationship, or even to give his young lover the legitimacy of a good marriage. It is a very speculative view, and one that does not affect our interpretation of the play. Although Shylock is seen as the main character, his part in terms of lines spoken is relatively small. He actually only has about 10% of the spoken lines, which speaks volumes about Shakespeare's skill at drawing a character and grabbing our attention in such a short space of time. It is Portia who has the biggest speaking role, with just over double the spoken lines that Shylock has. Partly this is because she spans both strands of the plot, but also because she is the driving force behind that plot, intentionally or otherwise. Ultimately, she is the reason why Antonio gets into debt with Shylock, and, of course, his means of escape from the bond through her legal arguments. Her study of the legal niceties of the Venetian law codes is only briefly explained, but shows her as an intelligent woman capable of reasoning, rhetoric and argument, all of which were considered part of the male preserve at the time. Even in her most personal conversations, she displays the ability to debate and reason. Often this is done within her speeches, where she uses the recognised rhetorical technique of antithesis, that is, presenting opposing ideas and concepts in very close proximity. In the speech where she considers asking Bassanio to stay longer before making his choice of casket, she opens by effectively commanding him to stay, with strong, simple language. But then she invokes opposites like love and hate, sight and blindness, choosing right and choosing wrong. And although her arguments with herself seem clear-headed at the start, she is genuinely torn over the question of if she should follow her love for Bassanio or the instructions of her father. As the speech progresses, she becomes less rational and more passionate towards Bassanio, revealing just how frustrated she feels about the terms of her father's will. It's a great example of how Shakespeare reveals character and inner conflict through the language characters use. But of course, this is not Portia's most famous speech in the play. Her speech to Shylock in court about mercy is a response to Shylock's questioning of why he should be compelled to show mercy. Portia's initial response, in the analogy with falling rain, is that mercy should not be demanded, but should come naturally. Mercy, she continues, is most powerful when dispensed by those who have most power. In this situation, Shylock is in the position of power over Antonio, thanks to Venetian law. Surely here, Shakespeare is throwing out the question to the audience and asking them to look into their own conscience and at the role of mercy in their lives. In the speech, that question even gets asked of the Queen, where mercy, Shakespeare suggests, should supersede the legal rights of the monarch to exact justice. As Portia says, "The quality of mercy is not strained, it droppeth as the gentle rain from heaven upon the place beneath. It is twice blessed, it blesseth him who gives it and him that takes. 'Tis mightiest in the mightiest. It becomes the throned monarch better than his crown. His sceptre shows the force of temporal power, the attribute to awe and majesty, wherein doth sit the dread and fear of kings. But mercy is above this sceptred sway. It is enthroned in the hearts of kings. It is as attribute to God himself. And earthly power doth then show likest God's, when mercy seasons justice. Therefore, Jew, though justice be thy plea, consider this, that in the course of justice none of us should see salvation. We do pray for mercy, and that same prayer doth teach us all to render the deeds of mercy." The argument for mercy is so strong in that speech, taking the argument to the monarch and above, that it seems that Shakespeare is trying to temper our response to Shylock's punishment. In fact, the response of Antonio's friends to the turnabout in Shylock's fortunes is far from merciful, mirroring his venom just a few moments earlier. It seems for them justice will not be tempered, seasoned by mercy. But hopefully everyone in the playhouse is listening, and perhaps those who have been baying with the Christian characters for Shylock's blood might just have been given pause for thought. The earliest recorded performance of The Merchant of Venice were two court performances in 1605, but then records fall silent until an adapted version was produced in 1701. Mostly the play became a vehicle for actor-managers to portray Shylock with varying degrees of sympathy, to the extent that sometimes the play was ended with the final exit of Shylock, missing the resolutions between Portia, Nerissa, Bassiano, Graziano and Antonio that make up the end of Act 4 and Act 5. Henry Irving's performance in 1879, opposite Ellen Terry playing Portia, was said to be the high point of his career. In a darker segment of the history of the play, in the early 1930s, as National Socialism took hold in Germany, book burning and banning became common practice across the country, along with the growing persecution of the Jews. Almost all non-German dramatists were banned, but Shakespeare survived and was appropriated as unsere Shakespeare, our Shakespeare. The canon was praised for its support for patriotism, for leadership and loyalty to the state, and this play was performed with a rigidly anti-Semitic point of view. It is estimated that The Merchant of Venice was performed about 50 times in 1933 and 1934. Productions were often preceded by lectures about how the audience should respond to the play, and Shylock in particular, and sometimes agents of the state were planted in the audience to encourage barracking of the characters at given points. Any production that made Shylock appear in the slightest way ambiguous, honourable or hard-working, and the Christians in any way at fault, were criticised or shut down. The most notorious production occurred in 1943 to honour the Nazi governor of Vienna. The text was adapted to make the character of Jessica the product of an affair between Shylock's wife and a Christian, thus making her acceptable under recently enacted racial purity laws. Productions also became more visually extreme in the portrayal of Shylock, who would often enter followed by devilish shadows, made claw-like gestures, and would even crawl across the stage. After 1948, some German actors and directors were charged in the post-Holocaust trials and banned from the stage, but the play still remained a difficult one to stage in Germany for many decades, thanks to this legacy. Performances in more modern times continued to be focused on Shylock, but presented the full original play, and the role has increasingly attracted actors of Jewish heritage. It is a play that has often been presented set in different periods, where Jewish identity and oppression had been of particular interest. The National Theatre's 1999 production set in pre-war Central Europe was particularly well regarded. The first production I ever saw was set in Victorian times, and the latest was set in the East End of London of 1936, with Oswald Molesley's black shirts prowling around the stage, and with Shylock portrayed as a Jewish matriarch. It is always going to be a difficult play to balance, but always interesting. There has been endless debate over Shakespeare's political intentions with regards to the character of Shylock. Like all Shakespeare's work, The Merchant of Venice is written from a 16th century perspective, but it is nevertheless somewhat politically ambiguous, and an example of how Shakespeare's humanist tendencies could not be suppressed. It offers a conflict of opposites for its audience to consider, rather than a didactic message. Once again, it is the strength of characterization that stops the play from being just another assertion of Christian ideologies, but rather Shakespeare exposes the ironies in the divide between the Christian and the Jewish cultures by presenting their shared humanity. Next time, we will be taking a little step back in the timeline when I will be talking about Thomas Kyd with returning guest Darren Feebury-Jones. And then it will be back to the Shakespeare history plays with a look at the first part of Henry IV. In the meantime, if you've not done so already, please join the Facebook page or group, or find the podcast on Instagram or Blue Sky to keep up to date with new episodes and other theatre-related things. If you do feel able to help out with the costs of running the podcast, then please head on over to Patreon, where you will find additional content for a small monthly fee or a one-off donation. You can also make a one-off show of support through Ko-fi.com. I look forward to your company next time, but if you have any comments or concerns in the meantime, you can contact me by email at thoetp@gmail.com or through the website, where you can leave me a voice message by clicking on the microphone icon, or you can write to me on the contact page. That's all at www.thehistoryofeuropeantheatre.com.